Hello, and welcome to this talk in the ALACT speaker series. ALACT stands for the Association for Informal Logic and Critical Thinking, and I am Donna Warren, Vice President of ALACT and a professor of philosophy at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. Today, it is my great honor and privilege to introduce David Moshman, who is a professor emeritus of educational psychology at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, who is here to talk to us about something very important, education for deliberative democracy. I will be monitoring the chat, and if there's time for questions and answers afterwards, I can also assist with that, or otherwise people can just speak up. So thank you very much. I turn it over to you, Professor Moshman.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. Thanks to Frank Fair for thinking to invite me. He's invited me to write chapters for a couple of books. That's how I know him. If you have any problems with anything I have to say about rationality, you can bring your complaints to Harvey Siegel, who taught me everything I know about that.
Thank you. I refuse the blame.
I'm going to do a very broad brush talk and leave plenty of time for questions, and I can elaborate on any points that you would like. Beginning with a study that I did on collaborative reasoning. That's the basis for my thinking about deliberative democracy. This is a study I did with Molly Guile, a graduate student, on the Wason selection task, which is a task with 4 cards. It's possible some of you are familiar with it. It probably was the most researched task in the psychological literature on logical reasoning in the from the 1970s through at least the 1990s. And this is, I'm not going to go into the details of the task, but it's a straightforward task with an if-then statement, and you have to understand the logic of an if-then statement. And everyone understands it when you explain it, but it's surprisingly difficult when you first see it. And if you just give this to a random group of college students, and there are literally thousands of studies doing this in various variations, usually about 10% of college students will succeed on the original abstract version of the selection task. But in teaching about it, I got into a practice of having the class discuss the task before I explained it, and seeing if they could come up with a solution. And they didn't always, but to my surprise, usually they did. After sufficient discussion, most groups of people, groups of students in this case, would come up with and agree on the right answer and understand it. So I had a graduate student who was looking for a project for her master's thesis, and I suggested doing this task in groups, as I had done informally in my classes, to see if we could document that groups do better on the selection task. And she did, and the results were quite striking. The individual students in this study, like is generally the case, 9% of them got the correct solution of the task. But we had 20 groups of 5 or 6 students, and 15 of the 20 groups, as 75%, solved the task correctly. Now, the fact that groups act rationally was a little surprising to me at first, because there's the notion of groupthink about groups, and groupthink is entirely a pejorative term about groups reasoning irrationally. And groupthink is a real phenomenon. Under some circumstances, groups do operate irrationally. But when I looked at the literature, I found that what I had seen in this study was not atypical. Under the right circumstances, groups are often more rational than the average person within them. And sometimes, as we found in our study, more rational than anybody within that. We had several cases in our study where no one in the group initially had the right answer, but the group unanimously agreed on the right answer ultimately. So this was not at all a matter of peer pressure. It's a matter of people convincing other people, and in some cases, a group convincing itself of a solution that nobody originally believed in. When you look at the circumstances under which groups operate rationally, and in particular, you look at the groups in our case where nobody initially had the right answer, but they figured out the right answer, there are 4 characteristics that can be observed there. One is respect for persons. These were just groups of college students who didn't know each other, but everyone had a kind of minimal basic respect for everybody else. Everyone listened to everyone else. Everyone felt free to say what they thought. So there was a kind of basic respect for persons that was just taken for granted. There was also respect for reasons. People didn't try to browbeat each other into agreeing with them. They would give reasons for why they thought their response was the correct one. And they would ask other people to supply reasons. They would listen to each other's reasons and sometimes disagree with them, but sometimes be convinced by them. So there was a respect for reasons that's easily observable in the way these groups operated. There was also a respect for truth. And this is partly the way we set up the task, asking people to reach a consensus. But it was more than that. There was a sense that they weren't just trying to get the others to go along so they could be done with the task. There was the sense that there's a right answer here, and we're working together to try to get to the right answer. So there was a kind of respect for truth that motivated everyone. They were all trying to look for the logically true answer to this task. And finally, the groups operated in a context of intellectual freedom. That's not to say anybody had to give a speech about their First Amendment rights. It was just taken for granted. Everyone could say what they thought about their task. Everyone listened to what others had to say. Nobody questioned anyone's right to say what they said, though they sometimes disagreed with what others said. So respect for intellectual freedom is something that also was just really just taken for granted here in the way the group operated. One thing I would note about that is that when people talk about the problems of democracy, often people will say it's because it takes a lot of training and education and whatever to get people to respect persons, to respect reasons, to respect truth, to understand intellectual freedom. But I think that's not the case. I think respect for truth and for reasons and for persons and for basic intellectual freedom is a human universal at its basic levels and can be seen, and looking at the literature, I'd say it can be seen in all people beyond the age of about 5 in all human cultures. Now, there are problems of translating that into democracy at advanced levels, but the problem is not that people don't have a basic respect for persons and reasons and truth. I think that's there from a very early age. And it's the basis for what's often called deliberative democracy, which is what I'll talk about next. Deliberative democracy is often talked about in literatures of political philosophy and political science. Deliberative democracy is a form of democracy that focuses on trying to reach a consensus rather than just having an immediate vote and the majority prevails. In deliberative democracy, you try to get discussion going. You have people discuss the things that they disagree on. As a whole, can reach a better solution maybe than most of the individuals could have reached within it. And ideally, we try to reach a consensus. If we can't reach a consensus, sometimes you have to fall back on majority rule. But in deliberative democracy, majority rule is not the ideal. It's the fallback option after you can't reach a consensus and need to take some action. But ideally, you try to reach a consensus. And when you look at the characteristics of deliberative democracy, they're the same characteristics we saw in this study of small groups operating just naturally. One is respect for persons. Democracy always has something to do with the will of the people, but sometimes we think of the people just as a mass. In liberal democracy, there's the idea that the people are persons, individual persons, and you need to have respect for each individual person. And liberal democracies would generally operate under some kind of constitution which has respect for minority rights, for freedom of speech and equal protection of the law and privacy for each individual person. A second characteristic of deliberative democracy that's particularly highlighted by deliberative democracy is respect for reasons. In deliberative democracy, you recognize that respect for persons means listening to them and their reasons for what they believe, and try and giving them reasons for what you believe if you're trying to convince them to change their ideas. So inherent in the idea of democracy, and particularly highlighted by deliberative democracy, is the idea of respect for reasons. Third, deliberative democracy, I think it involves a notion of respect for truth. In deliberative democracy, you're not just giving reasons because you're expected to do so. You're giving reasons and listening to reasons because there's the idea we're trying to get to the best solution. In complex social questions, there may not be one simple truth that you can get to, but still there's the idea that we can improve our understanding and reach more rational solutions when we work together, not with an aim of defeating our opponents, but with an aim of working together to reach the truth. And finally, deliberative democracy requires intellectual freedom. I think any form of democracy requires intellectual freedom, but deliberative democracy in particular, you can't have a deliberative democracy if some people don't feel free to say what they think and those ideas don't get into the discussion. A real deliberative democracy necessarily involves a context of intellectual freedom where everybody is entitled to believe what they believe and to say what they believe and to participate in the discussion, ideally with a goal of transcending themselves and getting to what's the best solution for the group. Okay, let me turn now to the threats to deliberative democracy. One thing deliberative democracy, I think, has going for it, as I said, is that respect for persons and reasons and truth and intellectual freedom really are natural and universal in their basic forms. The problems of deliberative democracy are not that people don't have these basic kinds of values, but that there are other things going on that overcome them. And in particular, there are two that I will focus on here. Incidentally, everything that I'm talking about here is in my book, Reasoning, Argumentation, Deliberative Democracy, and I would refer you to that for more detail on any of this, but I'm also happy to take questions later and discuss these things further. One major source of threats to deliberative democracy is that in addition to people's rational tendencies, people have systematic irrational tendencies. And there's a huge literature in cognitive psychology that refers to the common term is heuristics and biases. And the basic idea in this literature is that people's irrationality is not just a matter of occasionally making mistakes. We have systematic irrational or irrational processes, and much of our thinking and much of our behavior is in fact driven by processes that are more or less automatic and intuitive and have really nothing to do with rationality. Sometimes they work well enough because they're the product of evolution and they're adaptive, but often they're systematically irrational and lead us astray. So one problem for any sort of democracy is the systematic irrationality of human beings. A second general problem for democracy is problems related to identity. And I first came across these, one of my sidelines, I've studied genocide for many years. And when you look at genocides, three things that you always see in genocides are what I refer to as dichotomization, dehumanization, and denial. And you also see these in other cases of group violence. And you also see these more generally as just destructive forces that undermine democracy. Dichotomization is the tendency for people to divide into two groups, and each group is opposed to the other group. And once you've got an us versus them situation, you no longer can have a productive kind of discussion that considers many points of view. There are just 2 points of view, and each group wants to win and wants the other to lose. And in the extreme, people see the other group not just as different and having wrong ideas, but as really less than them. And in the extreme, as really not persons at all. And we just see the others as just a kind of impersonal mass that can't be expected to participate in the democratic processes with us because they're an impersonal mass. And if there's a threat to them, they're seen like a colony of wasps, just something to be destroyed. We don't think of them as individual people. And finally, you see processes of denial. Dehumanization is itself a kind of denial because we do things to people that we really don't think are moral and just couldn't bring ourselves to do to other people. but we do it anyway, and we find ways to not think of them as people. And once we've done those things, we often deny what we have done or restructure the way we think about it so it doesn't seem as wrong. There are all kinds of processes of denial. And at high levels, people can use high-level intellectual processes to deny what's right there before their eyes. So the people's natural irrationality and active processes related to identity of dichotomization, dehumanization, and denial are serious threats to democracy and really undermine democratic functioning. And in fact, these are so serious that many theorists of democracy have questioned whether democracy is really possible in the long run, whether it can really work. Maybe peoples are just too irrational in their basic ways of thinking and in their identity processes for democracy to even be possible. And I take those arguments very seriously. I don't think democracy is automatically going to be successful, but I do think there's still hope for democracy. And let me suggest 3 reasons for hope. One is that when you look at human development, and I'm a developmental psychologist who studies cognitive development, it's my core original focus. When you look at cognitive development in children, it's very clear that rationality develops. Even 2-year-olds show rational competencies that you would never see in a very young infant. 5-year-olds routinely show rational competencies that you would just never see in a 2-year-old. 8-year-olds show forms of reasoning and levels of rationality that you would just never see in a child who's just turning 5. And adolescents and adults, teenagers and adults, routinely show forms of reasoning and levels of rationality that you would simply never see in an 8-year-old. So when you look at the data, there's no question that people can be rational and that rationality, in fact, develops over the first 11 or 12 years of life. And by the time children reach 11 or 12, they're getting to forms of rationality that you don't see in young children and that you do see commonly in adolescents and adults. Now, there are possibilities of further development through education. I'll get to that in a moment. But at the least, through 11 or 12, there's a process of development that leads to higher levels of rationality. Now, how can you reconcile that with the literature on human irrationality, on people operating on the basis of automatic heuristics and biases? Well, even within the adult literature, recent theorizing, especially since the turn of the century, has gone to what are referred to as dual process models. Dual process is a kind of general framework. It's not a particular theory, but dual process theories share the notion that people operate in at least 2 different ways. There are the automatic, intuitive kinds of processes that we see in the heuristics and biases literature, but people also can operate irrationally and do operate rationally under the right kinds of circumstances. And so human cognition is a matter of an interplay between at least 2 different kinds of processes. When you add in the developmental aspect, I think what you see is automatic heuristics and biases are seen throughout life, beginning in early infancy in various forms. And you don't see deliberate reflective processes in young infants, but you just see an ongoing development of deliberate and reflective processes beginning in infancy and continuing for at least the first 11 or 12 years of life. What's different in this developmental dual process model than traditional developmental theories is that the more advanced forms of rationality don't replace the earlier intuitive processes, they supplement them. So mature human cognition is not just the most advanced forms of reflective and deliberate thinking. It's a interaction between that level and the automatic kinds of intuitions and biases and heuristics that continue to exist. In the simplest version of dual process, the reflective level overrides the other. Actually, that's too simple, and there is a rationality in our automatic processes, and our more deliberate and reflective processes, when our identities get hold of them, can in fact lead us into all kinds of irrational and indefensible conclusions. So the full dual process model is a complex matter, which I've discussed more elsewhere, and I won't get into here. But the basic idea here is that we have both rational and irrational processes going on, and there's a complex interplay of them that accounts for the behavior of adults. The fact that there is rationality in human behavior is reason for hope. We're not simply doomed to irrational or unreflective kinds of biases and intuitions. The second reason for hope is what I think of as deliberative democracy's superpower. Deliberative democracy relies on argumentation. And when people engage together in collaborative kinds of reasoning, as we just talked about, they do better than individuals under the right kinds of circumstances. So by marshaling the right kinds of circumstances that allow for collaborative reasoning under conditions of intellectual freedom and respect for persons and reasons and truth, you can in fact get more rationality than you typically get from individual human beings. That doesn't happen easily or automatically, but it's another source of hope for democracy. If a democracy is set up properly to allow collaborative reasoning, it can operate more rationally than the individuals who compose it. And finally, rationality can be promoted through education. And this can happen at any level, but it's maybe particularly important as you get beyond the age of 11 or 12. There's a lot of room for further development of rationality. But beyond that age, further development of rationality is not natural and universal. It occurs when there's reason for it to occur, and the proper kinds of educational systems can create the conditions that help people to progress to higher levels of rationality. And that brings me to the final topic that I've been leading to, is the idea of education for deliberative democracy. Given the role of education in promoting rationality, a deliberative democracy really relies on the right kind of education to promote the right kind of thinking that allows democracy to take place. Okay, turning now to the last part, and then I'll open for questions. The idea of education for deliberative democracy can be thought of as a synthesis of education for rationality and education for democracy, which I think are very closely related and overlapping. They're not quite the same thing. Education for rationality typically talks about educating each individual student so that they will be as rational as possible, which is, of course, a good and important thing. Education for democracy typically talks about educating students in a way that they will be good citizens of a democracy, which is about how we work together with others. Education for deliberative democracy, I think, has the best of both of those. Education for deliberative democracy focuses on preparing students so that they will be as rational as possible, but including the idea of being able to work together with others to be even more rational than they could be on their own. And this leads right into democratic functioning. And correspondingly, in terms of democracy, education for deliberative democracy recognizes that being a good citizen of a democracy is not just knowing where and when to vote, it's being able to work with others in democratic deliberations. So education for deliberative democracy focuses on argumentation, and I would highlight argumentation as a crucial part of education, especially when you're talking about education for deliberative democracy, because argumentation promotes development in itself, and it prepares students for participating in rational argumentative processes. And I would especially highlight here collaborative reasoning. Argumentation can also be debate, and there's obviously a role for a debate where there are two sides and each side is trying to win the debate. But overall, I think it's best to focus on argumentation as collaborative rationality. Argumentation is a way that we work together to do better than we could do individually, to reach more rational conclusions than most of us could reach individually. Education for deliberative democracy would have all of the characteristics, and I'm going to wind up with this, all of the characteristics that I talked about earlier is rational group functioning. In Education for Deliberative Democracy, you operate on the basis of respect for persons, including respect for each individual student, but you're trying to get them to go beyond just the bare minimum of respect for persons to having really a moral commitment to persons over and above a basic kind of moral requirements. In terms of respect for reasons, similarly, we don't have to teach children to respect reasons. They do that naturally from the age of about 5, but we need to deepen that and help students see the reason for respecting reasons and develop a stronger commitment to rationality in general. And that's a big project that I think should be a major focus throughout education at all levels. And finally, respect for truth. And again, we don't have to teach respect for truth at the basic elementary level. All children understand that by the time they're 5 years old or so. But we have to develop more of a commitment to truth. And this involves epistemic development. It also involves understanding some of the subtleties that we can't figure out the truth for ourselves in every case, or even in most cases. Respect for truth, to a large extent, is a matter of relying on institutions and on expertise. And that that's a matter of knowing how institutions function and how institutions generate truth and what sort of institutions we can rely on. And presumably a properly functioning educational system operates on a basis of respect for truth, and students can appreciate that by being part of it and seeing more generally how that operates in democracy. Students also need to learn respect for experts. That doesn't mean there's some small elite group that we always rely on them for the answers. Understanding expertise involves understanding that expertise is domain specific. Nobody's an expert on everything, but people can be experts on particular things. And if you're looking for the truth, a good starting point is to identify who are the experts on this topic and what do they have to say. And if the experts have a consensus, that's a good basis for believing that. They're not always going to be right, but you have a strong basis for believing something where there's an expert consensus. This is also something that education needs to focus on and help students understand why we rely on experts and how we rely on experts and when we should and what sort of experts we should rely on. And finally, a properly functioning educational system needs to be an environment of intellectual freedom. And by having students operate in an environment of intellectual freedom, this prepares them for functioning in democracy. And in work that I have cited in the outline, and you can look at further, I've argued that we should use the term academic freedom broadly to refer to intellectual freedom in academic work. So this would include, academic freedom certainly would include the intellectual freedom of college faculty to do their research and design the curriculum and teach as they see fit, which is what we usually call academic freedom. But I would use the term more broadly to include academic freedom for teachers and students at all levels of education, and for anybody engaged in inquiry of any sort, whether it's formal research or just students engaged in inquiry. We need to respect intellectual freedom. Respecting intellectual freedom doesn't mean that everybody is right, but it means that everyone has a right to pursue their ideas and to say what they think and participate in discussion. And by having students educated in this kind of environment, I think it promotes development, it promotes rationality, and prepares students for functioning in a deliberative democracy. And I see we're exactly at 10:30. That's a good time to stop. And I'm happy to take any questions, or if you have any comments or any discussion, let's just open it up.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you so much. So I open the floor for questions. Harvey.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks, Dave. That was vintage Moshman. Very nice. I don't disagree with any of it, but I wonder how you your claim. One of your claims is that we are naturally rational and we are also naturally irrational. I realize you didn't say it in quite that way, but Do you see why I think you said that?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So can you say more about how these two things either go together or are reconciled or fight with one another, or what is the relationship between these two natural tendencies of ours?
Well, one thing I'd elaborate on there, and the question of what we even mean by rationality. And I think there are two different aspects to rationality. There's a kind of objective aspect. You can just look at a piece of reasoning and say, this followed rules of logic that it properly should have followed, and therefore it's rational. Or this is not following rules of logic, and therefore it's not rational. So you can objectively evaluate whether something is rational by whether it meets rational standards, such as logical standards or other kinds of rational standards. Another aspect of rationality I think of as the subjective aspect or the metacognitive aspect. Being rational is a matter of not just functioning automatically, it's a matter of deliberately thinking about things and reflecting on things and deciding what's the right thing. Even if you make an error in doing that, I would say you're still functioning as a rational agent when you function that way, even if you make an error. Whereas when somebody just engages in an automatic process, even if it's rational at some objective level of evaluation, it's rational as judged by an outside philosopher. It's not really rational in a subjective sense, in that there's no subject that's acting rationally in the sense of knowing what they're doing or reflecting on it. It's just automatic. So with that in mind, then, what's going on in cognition, I think, is you've got automatic processes that are presumably the product of evolution and early development, but we're not even aware of them. Those processes may be rational in some way, at least in the sense that if we're operating in a normal human environment, the kind of environment that our species evolved in, our automatic ways of responding to things are likely to be rational in the objective sense. Even if we're not thinking about what we're doing, they're rational in the objective sense that they are adaptive. For example, we may have a bias to attend to certain things, and those are in fact the things that are worth attending to, even though we don't know it. So there's a rationality of sorts involved in automatic processes. What goes on in development is you get you get more reflective and deliberate processes, which are not always going to be rational in the objective sense, but they enrich cognition in the sense that you now are able to reflect on what you're doing, which may mean you recognize errors in what you're doing, or you recognize the value of some of your automatic processes, and you can improve on them and operate then at a higher level of rationality. But where it gets subtle is that the higher level of rationality is not just that the deliberate processes overrule the automatic processes. The deliberative processes reflect on the automatic processes and lead you to what's likely to, in general, to be more rational behavior, but sometimes not. So there remain complicated, I'm not sure if this is getting to your question exactly, but there remain complicated issues of what exactly it even is to be rational. But I think development, with the progress in our deliberate and reflective processes, gives us the resources to operate more rationally in objective ways as well as subjective. But it's not at all a sure thing.
Right. Okay. So if I may just have a very small follow-up. So you're not saying that objective rationality is what's the distinction you just drew? You've got objective and subjective rationality, and then you've got
automatic versus deliberate.
No, that's not the one.
Intuitive versus reflective.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm not. But if it comes to me.
Michael?
Yeah, thank you. So I would like to first follow up on Harvey, and that's basically an additional comment to what David said. I mean, there's this idea, there's this cognitive reflection test, which I think is very instructive with regard to the distinction of the dual processing. So you're getting a task, and if you're using a cognitive shortcut, then you come up with the wrong answer. And there's clearly only one answer. But if you reflect on the task, then chances are higher that you get to the right solution. So it's basically what David described as automatic reasoning and reflective reasoning. And the evolutionary advantage of not reflecting is it's just faster, so it's a cognitive shortcut. And that makes it intriguing. Now, what I also would add to that is research on so-called motivated reasoning, which is not only important in psychology, but also in political science. And there the idea is, and that goes back to what David said about identity, so that our political identities, for example, are determining our reasoning processes and which kind of arguments we find convincing and which we don't find convincing. And here, one interesting result is that this kind of motivated reasoning is especially important in better educated people, so it's not kind of the stupid ones who are engaging in this kind of unreflected reasoning. No, it's the more educated ones. So that's just in addition to the earlier discussion. But what I would like to talk about is another thing, and that refers to the challenge of education. So, David, I'm completely with you with regard to everything that you. Now, with regard to educating for the, so I thought a lot about that, and there's one problem. I mean, the question is how to teach it. You cannot simply lecture on it, so you need to provide spaces of practice in which people are developing the kind of respect and the skills and everything that's needed to be successful. Now, if you generate these spaces of practical experience, then that is kind of risky, especially, since we, as educators, we have a responsibility of what's going on. And if you have, really getting the experience of deliberation requires, I think, that you talk about something that is not shared by everybody. So you're focusing on things that are controversial. But if you're focusing on things that are controversial, it is very hard to control what's going on in an educational setting, So this is kind of I base my own research in this area on problem-based learning, which means you give a high degree of autonomy to the learners, and they have to figure it out in a team. But again, it's a question of responsibility that is relevant with regard to that. So I would like to add something to that, because we developed a software tool which is designed for exactly the kind of education that you are talking about. It also tries to combine deliberation or rationality or rational argumentation with open debate on controversial issues. And the link that we are using to combine both these areas is a focus on so-called wicked problems. And these are problems which are framed differently depending on your point of view. You could say every political problem is a wicked problem because people have different perspectives. So it's a challenge. But you find them also, for example, in technology development. Think about social media and the use of micro-targeting that is kind of common in these areas. So you can perceive this as a wicked problem, and you can give this to students and then let them deliberate. So what the software tool does is it's basically a workflow management system which guides teams of students through the process, starting with first formulating the problem, then analyzing who are the stakeholders, who has a different perspective, and then working on what you highlighted as consensus building, developing a proposal that might be better than the initial ideas about how to deal with the problem. So that's my comment. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and I think that's all very good, and I agree. You can't teach someone rationality directly by just telling them things. They need to be actively engaged. but you don't want to just have a group of students actively engaged. The whole point of education is you got an expert there who can give good guidance and can help them, can set up the problem in a way that it will be productive and provide input that will be productive. An example of a curriculum, the Columbia Education Psychologist, Deanna Kuhn, has a argumentation curriculum that I think can work at a variety of ages, though she focuses mainly on middle school age. But she gets students engaged in argumentation on very controversial topics. I mean, the death penalty, really controversial social topics, but they understand how to respect each other and not just yell at each other. And that's really not a problem at all. She also makes sure that there are sources of information available. She doesn't just start with, here's information about this topic, but as the team, there are different teams going to argue with each other. As they're developing their argument, they can look up what's the actual information on this kind of topic. You know, does the death penalty actually have a deterrent effect, or does it not? Or doesn't have certain bad effects, or does it not? Some of them are empirical questions, and students learn to identify when this is an empirical question, and she has information available, actual studies that students can read. But rather than start with the studies, they start with the task of argumentation, and then they see what information they need to make their arguments more convincing. The limitation of her curriculum, I think, is that it's all in the context of a debate. And ultimately, they're trying to win the debate. They have teams, so the teams are working together collaboratively, which is a good thing. But I think what's needed for democracy is a further step of, beyond debate, having the whole group work together and recognize that the two sides of this debate are not the only two possibilities. Maybe we can find an even better possibility if we put our minds together and collaborate. And that's what you want to get students to do, and to understand the value of doing that.
Exactly. Thank you.
Let me also note, as just an example, in the actual task in the Moshman and Guile study, the natural heuristic response, which leads you wrong, you've got a hypothesis of the form if P then Q. People look for cases of P and Q that they think will confirm the hypothesis. But what you need to do is to look for cases of P and not Q, which would disconfirm the hypothesis. And that's where it takes deliberation and reflection to realize that you have to look for disconfirming cases. And then the further insight is that disconfirming cases are all that matter. If a experiment is not going to could possibly disconfirm the hypothesis, then it's not really testing it at all. So there's a natural tendency to look for confirming information, which leads you astray, and you have to overcome that. When you go beyond a simple logical problem, which nobody cares about, to real life controversial matters, people's identities kick in. And when your identity is at stake, you're even more going to be focused on finding confirming information. And so you're going to see things that you're going to look for and see things that fit with what your identity tells you must be right. And you're going to ignore or disparage anything that goes against it. So the natural heuristic bias is further exacerbated by the higher level kind of reflection. So higher level reflection doesn't naturally or automatically overcome it, but especially in a group context, people can see that we all have different ideas here. And when you think about it, this idea of looking for disconfirming cases really is very important and unavoidable. And so it has more salience under those circumstances. So there's a potential for overcoming biases, but it's harder at the level of high-level democratic disputes, because you not only have the natural biases that can lead you astray, but they are reinforced by identity considerations that in some cases, and as you said, very intelligent people can be very elaborate and systematic in using their intelligence to not see what they don't want to see.
Frank, you had your hand. Go ahead.
Yeah, just a question, Dave. Some of what you're talking about reminded me very much of the aspirations in the philosophy for children movement. And I did a little research with a group from our College of Education. And it was really neat because it was junior high school students. And we had materials that were cheap, like $25 for each teacher, little stories. And while you didn't really need things that were controversial to get people talking with each other and arguing with each other and so forth, and you start in small groups of like dyads and then eventually work out to the whole class. So the class becomes a community of inquiry. And it was really neat because we did then testing on the cognitive abilities test. And the results were that the kids that had those 1 hour per week for 26 weeks lessons scored better on the cognitive abilities test, which was kind of standard instrument. And 3 years later, when they were sophomores in high school, they scored higher on the cognitive abilities test than the ones who had not gotten. So I looked at that result and I thought, and we were replicating a study that was done in Scotland. And I thought, this is not, it's not that expensive. The teachers involved had no training other than a 1 day in service. The materials were cheap. And the kids reported things like, gee, I no longer hit my sister as often, which seemed like a good outcome. Okay. And things like, well, I didn't think, George had a thought in his head. No, but there we are, we're talking with each other. So I'm thinking the sort of the training for democratic citizenship is very helpful if it begins kind of as early as possible. And that we don't have to wait till they get to college and try to work on things there. So I would just suggest the P4C movement it got similar aspirations, at least, to what you're talking about. And of course, there's all sorts of varieties now around the world and everything, but it's, in my experience, it was a very, very intriguing set of results.
And I think developmentally, what you need for things like this to work is the students need to understand that different people can have different ideas, that somebody can believe something that you know to be false, and that you can work through disagreements through discussion. And all of this involves what developmental psychologists call theory of mind. And a basic theory of mind develops about the age of 4. So that by the time kids get to school, even kindergarten, they already have the basic theory of mind skills of knowing about minds having different points of view and people believing things different from them and how to deal with that they're really ready for the kinds of education we're talking about. It probably wouldn't work with 2 or 3-year-olds, but beginning around age 5, I think students are ready for what might seem fairly advanced kinds of argumentation. And they spontaneously engage in such argumentation if you really look for it.
Thank you. Don, did you have a question? And then Kevin?
Well, I did have a question for David. Some of us, even here this morning, have looked fairly carefully at a lot of mega studies or meta studies of the critical thinking test and the pre and post test scores. And this is for college students, but the effect size gains are pathetic. And at best, maybe a 0.5, which, has got as I pointed out, 2 questions better on a 50 question test. And I just wondered what your response is to the effect of a college education on the rationality, assuming these tests are valid and good tests, on the rationality of a college education and college students.
Well, I certainly think it's possible and important to promote rationality in college students, and I think college education does that. But by the time students get to college, they're already rational to a considerable degree, and there are also all kinds of irrational factors going on that you're not going to get rid of. So it's hard to really improve it. I think that extensive work in college does, in fact, promote rationality to some extent, but maybe not as much as one might think. And any particular program, I wouldn't rule out that a program could have really good effects, but you have to be realistic about how much, in the broader scheme of things, how much effect you can expect one program to have, even if it's, an hour a week or a whole course over a period of months. Still, it's a small portion of a person's time over a period of just a few months compared to their whole lifespan and what they're doing. So obviously we want to have the most effective ways of promoting rationality, and it's disappointing that it's so hard to do, but it's not really surprising that it's hard to find really substantial effects from a single intervention.
Thanks. Kevin?
Yeah, thank you very much for the talk. I just wanted to mention one hurdle that I think hasn't been mentioned yet, and that is sort of the tendency for projection. I mean, Trump is an excellent example. I mean, you call him anti-democratic, he'd say, "Oh no, I'm the one who's democratic here. I'm the one for against voter fraud and that sort of thing." And you know, and I'm not the one that disputes academic freedom. In fact, I promote academic freedom. I'm just anti-propaganda. I'm just anti-woke curriculum and that sort of thing. And I think that sort of response is a major hurdle because of the siloing effect. They have their own scientists. They have their own experts, and they're the first to claim that, David, I'm following your exact recommendations. You know, respect for real persons and respect for real academics and that sort of thing. I think that is just such a huge hurdle right now for education, because the anti-education, anti-intellectual crowd is the one claiming we are for education, real education, you know, that sort of thing. And I think, like I said, that is the real hurdle I see going on today, and it's really tough to get a wedge into that approach, to argue against it, to try and right that wrong. And so I agree with you as an educational ideal. Yeah, a critical thinking across the curriculum, that sort of thing, is the route to go. The question is how to get that foot in the door when they are saying, "Oh yeah, we're the critical thinkers here."
Yeah, it is a huge problem. One slightly encouraging thing I would say on these kinds of debates, when you look below the debate, there is an agreement on basic concepts. Let's take academic freedom, for example. When somebody says you're violating academic freedom, it's very rare for somebody to respond, "That's right, because I think academic freedom is bad." The response is always, "I support academic freedom." I think you can draw on that and say, okay, that's good. We all support academic freedom. That's a good thing. But apparently we disagree on what academic freedom is exactly. So let's talk about it. And in fact, academic freedom is a complex and subtle concept, and there's room for disagreement. Similarly, when people say college professors are indoctrinating their students, college professors never respond by saying, "Yes, we are, and that's what we're here to do." They always say, "No, we're not indoctrinating their students." Well, a way to get a productive discussion is to say, well, we all agree that indoctrination is wrong. Let's talk about exactly what indoctrination is. And in that case, you got to try to convince people that simply teaching an idea that somebody objects to is not indoctrination. Indoctrination is where you have no academic basis for teaching that, or you teach it in a way that coerces students into believing it rather than convincing them. When you pursue that line, I think you can get somewhat more of a consensus that we're all for academic freedom, we're all against indoctrination, and with some discussion, we may be able to work out some degree of consensus about what do we mean by these things and what exactly needs to be done. Obviously, this is not going to solve all these problems, but I think that's the way to go if you're trying to have a productive discussion, is to look beneath the disagreement. You can always find things that are agreed on. Even if they're agreed on at a superficial verbal level, it's a good starting point. And then you can say, what do we mean by this? And can we work out a slightly higher level of agreement on what really respects academic freedom and what really is or isn't indoctrinative?
Very good. I agree wholeheartedly. It's just it just brings out how damn hard the job is going to be. Thank you very much.
Well, I think on that optimistic note, I just have 2 minutes, and I cannot resist. I can't resist. Have you had any pushback to the notion of truth? Has anyone ever said, respect for truth? Truth is an obsolete notion. We live in a postmodern world where it's we negotiate our worldviews according to a variety of perspectives.
Is that true?
I don't think that's true. Exactly.
Yeah, right.
And that's always my response when people sort of bring that. I'm just wondering.
Well, an interesting historical trend there is that back like in the 1990s, there was a lot of postmodernist, relativistic kind of thinking in academe. I mean, Harvey and I talked about that all the time back in the day. And it was a troublesome thing. But these days, you hear less of that, and you hear more of academics believing in truth, sometimes even going too far to simplistic notions of we know the truth and you have to listen to us. But I think that the kind of postmodernist relativist conception of truth, which was very popular in academe for a while, has sort of gone away, maybe in reaction to Donald Trump and all kinds of issues of fake news. Academics are more focused on truth. And there too, almost nobody really discounts truth these days. I mean, I'm sure there are some relativists who do, but for the most part, people say, yes, truth is important, and I'm the one who knows the truth, and you're the one who's mistaken. So even on truth, I think you can get a consensus on truth. And of course, you have to be wary of that, because we don't want to get into a simplistic notion of there's a final truth and professors know what it is. But we can reach, I think, some degree of agreement that we're all moving toward truth or trying to get to truth. And we can talk further about how do we know what truth is and how do we know if we're making progress toward it. So I haven't really had pushback from people who simply deny truth these days, though historically, of course, there's been some.
Thank you. Now I will sleep better. Now I can maybe climb out from the bunker, because I've avoided using that word because I was so tired of continually needing to sigh and say, well, is that true? Is it true that there's no truth? Or to try some odd reframing of the concept. And that's my sense too, has been there's been less of that, but I just didn't know if that was your sense too, or if people just have stopped talking to me. So I'm glad that that's your sense.
I find it useful to talk about truth as an ideal, as opposed to a goal that we're going to reach. That helps get you away from simplistic notions of truth, but retaining the notion that truth is very important. And in academia, the idea that truth is what we're all about. That's not to say we've reached it or will ever reach it, but we are trying to make progress toward truth. And if there's no such thing, why do we even do it?
Thank you. Thank you. So on that optimistic note, I think it is 11 o'clock, and I shall put an end to this wonderful discussion. I will have this posted on our YouTube channel within a few days. So thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Well, I've enjoyed that. If anyone wants any readings or anything else, you can reach me at dmoshman1@unl.edu. That's DMOSHMAN, my name, #1 at UNL.edu. And I'm happy to send you links or publications or anything you're interested in, or hear any comments you may have.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Dave. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Great job.
Thanks.